The evening was quiet, almost too quiet for the city streets that usually buzzed with people leaving work, cars honking, and the distant hum of traffic. The FBI director, a man with years of experience and countless hours spent in the line of duty, was driving home after a long day filled with meetings and briefings. He had spent the day going over reports, discussing sensitive cases, and making decisions that affected lives across the country. Now all he wanted was to reach his home and have a moment of peace. The city was alive, yet it felt calm from the driver's seat. Streetlights reflected off the polished hood of his unmarked car, casting a glow across the dashboard. He adjusted the rearview mirror, checking the road behind him, and allowed himself a small sigh. Even with decades of law enforcement experience, driving through the city at night required focus and attention. It wasn't always easy, but it was routine and he trusted his instincts. As he approached a busy intersection, a patrol car appeared behind him with flashing lights. He immediately noted the police officer's signals to pull over. Although he had dealt with law enforcement on countless occasions, there was something in the officer's movements that made the situation feel tense. The officer was young, maybe fresh out of the academy, eager to enforce the rules but perhaps not fully seasoned in handling unexpected situations. The director slowed the car and pulled to the side of the road, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. He kept his eyes on the officer in the side mirror, taking note of his stance and posture. From his experience, he knew that the slightest wrong move could escalate a routine stop into something dangerous. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm and collected. The officer stepped out of his patrol car, his hand resting near his holstered weapon. He approached with caution, but there was a tension in his body language, a hint of suspicion that something was not quite right. When he reached the window, he looked at the driver and spoke in a firm voice. "License and registration," he demanded. The director complied, retrieving his documents carefully and handing them over. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the officer's rigid movements. The officer glanced at the papers, then back at the driver, and his expression shifted slightly from routine seriousness to unease. He studied the car, noting the tinted windows and unmarked plates, which to him suggested a vehicle that might require extra attention. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer said, his tone sharper now. The director froze for a moment, surprised by the sudden command. It wasn't unusual for officers to ask drivers out of their cars, but the insistence in his voice suggested that this was more than a routine stop. He raised his hands slightly in a gesture of compliance and slowly stepped out. He could see the tension in the officer's eyes, the uncertainty of someone who had been trained to react quickly, but not necessarily to think deeply in the moment. As he stood outside the car, the officer drew his weapon. The click of the slide being released echoed slightly in the quiet evening. The director's heart rate quickened, but his face remained composed. He raised his hands higher, careful not to make any sudden movements. Around them, neighbors who had been watching from their windows began to gather, curious and concerned about the confrontation happening on their street. "I'm the FBI director," he said calmly. "Here are my credentials." He held up his identification, hoping that the display of authority and proof would de-escalate the situation. The officer's grip on the weapon didn't falter. His eyes darted between the ID and the driver, clearly struggling to process what he was seeing. It was rare, almost unimaginable, to confront someone of such high authority in what he assumed was a routine traffic stop. His training told him to act cautiously, yet his instincts screamed that this could be more serious than it appeared. "Sir, put your hands where I can see them," the officer shouted, his voice trembling slightly. The adrenaline was coursing through him, sharpening his focus but clouding his judgment. He had been trained to protect the public and enforce the law, but he had never imagined this exact scenario. The director, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, showed no sign of fear. His calmness was deliberate, a strategy he had used countless times when diffusing tense situations. "I understand your caution," he said, his voice steady. "I am cooperating fully. Please check my identification and verify it. I am not a threat." The officer hesitated, still gripping his weapon, his breathing heavy. He looked around, noticing the small crowd gathering at a safe distance. Some were filming the incident on their phones, capturing every moment. The realization that this encounter was being recorded added a new layer of pressure. He couldn't afford to make a mistake, yet he also couldn't ignore the credentials in front of him. Dispatch was called, and the officer spoke quickly into his radio, requesting verification of the driver's identity. The director continued to stand calmly, hands raised, waiting for the confirmation to arrive. Every second felt longer than the last, stretching the tension in the cool evening air. Neighbors whispered to each other, their curiosity mixed with concern. Some speculated about what had happened, unable to imagine that a top federal official could be treated this way. The situation seemed surreal, almost like a scene from a movie, yet it was happening in real life. The director kept speaking, his voice soothing but firm. He shared small bits of information, explaining the situation without revealing sensitive details. He emphasized his cooperation and his desire for a peaceful resolution. His approach was methodical, relying on his years of experience to manage both the officer's fear and the bystanders' growing interest. Minutes passed, each one feeling heavier than the last. The officer's radio crackled with updates, his eyes darting between the credentials and the driver. He was caught in a difficult position, unsure whether to trust his own judgment or the proof in front of him. The tension was palpable, and even the air seemed to hold its breath. The director noticed the subtle signs of stress, the officer's shaking hands, the slight wavering of his stance, the rapid blinking as he tried to process the situation. He recognized the human side of the law enforcement officer, the fear of making a fatal mistake in a moment that could spiral out of control. Rather than reacting with anger, he remained patient, offering words that reassured rather than threatened. Finally, backup units began to arrive, the sound of sirens cutting through the quiet evening. The presence of additional officers brought a shift in the atmosphere. The tension did not disappear, but the situation began to stabilize as more trained personnel assessed what was happening. The director continued to follow instructions carefully, maintaining his calm demeanor and steady presence. Through it all, the officer who had initiated the stop remained wary, his emotions a mixture of fear, confusion, and the weight of responsibility. He had acted out of duty, following the training he had received, but the reality of the situation was far more complicated than any scenario he had practiced. The director's patience and composure began to have an effect. The officer's movement slowed slightly, the grip on the weapon easing and the tension in his shoulders diminishing. The bystanders, sensing a shift, quieted down, waiting to see what would happen next. The scene had turned into a delicate dance of authority, human instinct, and the power of calmness in the face of fear. The radio finally crackled with confirmation from dispatch. The identification was verified. The director was indeed the FBI director. Relief washed over the arriving officers, and the initial officer's hands slowly lowered the weapon. The realization of what had occurred, the misunderstanding and the potential danger that had just passed began to sink in. In that moment, the gravity of the encounter became clear to everyone present. The director had faced a life-threatening situation not from an adversary or a criminal, but from a colleague who had acted with caution and fear. It was a strange and ironic twist, a reminder of how quickly situations could escalate and how delicate the balance of authority and safety could be. The director finally spoke again, his voice calm but carrying the weight of the experience. He acknowledged the officer's role, emphasizing understanding and the importance of protocol, while also recognizing the risk that had just been avoided. It was a human moment filled with complexity, relief, and a quiet sense of reflection. Neighbors slowly returned to their homes, some still filming, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The city returned to its normal rhythm, yet for those involved, nothing would feel normal for a long time. The director continued home, grateful for the verification, but deeply aware of how fragile such encounters could be, even for someone at the highest level of law enforcement. After the initial verification confirmed the FBI director's identity, the tension in the air did not immediately dissipate. The first officer, still visibly shaken, lowered his weapon but kept a cautious eye on the director. Backup officers surrounded the area, forming a protective circle, but there was a sense of uncertainty among everyone. No one had anticipated that a routine traffic stop could escalate into such a high-stakes situation. The director remained calm, hands still raised slightly in a gesture of non-threatening cooperation. His years of experience had taught him that in situations of heightened tension, Patience and steady behavior could prevent disaster. He spoke in a calm tone, thanking the officers for their caution and reminding them that he had understood the importance of following proper procedure, even under extreme pressure. "I appreciate your vigilance," he said, his voice steady. "It's important that everyone stays safe. But now that identities are confirmed, let's resolve this peacefully." His calmness seemed to gradually influence the first officer, whose body language started to relax, though anxiety still lingered. The bystanders who had gathered began to murmur among themselves, some exchanging glances and whispering about the unusual scene unfolding. A few had their phones out, capturing the events. Social media would likely light up with these videos within hours, and the officers were well aware of that possibility. This awareness added an extra layer of pressure. They had to manage the situation carefully, not just for immediate safety, but also for public perception. One of the backup officers stepped forward and spoke into a radio, coordinating with the local precinct to ensure that proper documentation of the incident was created. Every movement was precise, almost choreographed, as each officer tried to regain control over the unpredictable scenario. The director observed quietly, his focus unwavering. He knew that this was as much a test of human behavior and emotional management as it was about protocol. The initial officer, still shaken by the confrontation, began explaining his perspective to the backup officers. He described how he had seen an unmarked car with tinted windows driving cautiously through the neighborhood, and how his instincts had prompted him to act. He admitted that he had been nervous and unsure, which had contributed to the intensity of the stop. It was a confession that revealed the human side of law enforcement, the fear of making mistakes and the weight of responsibility carried in every decision. The director listened carefully, acknowledging the officer's honesty. He understood that mistakes were part of human nature, even in high-stakes situations. His approach was never to humiliate or condemn, but to guide and educate, using his presence as a calm authority to diffuse tension. Meanwhile, the scene began attracting more attention. Neighbors who had initially stayed inside were now leaning from windows or stepping onto porches to observe from a safe distance. Some of them offered quiet words of concern, asking if everyone was okay. The director, aware of the importance of setting an example, reassured them with a polite nod and a calm explanation that the situation was under control. His demeanor helped stabilize the growing unease among the crowd. The backup officers started a methodical process to gather information. They checked the vehicle, verified registration details, and ensured that no potential threats were overlooked. The director cooperated fully, understanding that transparency was essential to maintaining trust and credibility. He spoke with clarity, answering questions without arrogance or impatience, demonstrating that even in tense moments, respect and calm communication could prevail. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere began to shift. The initial officer, having calmed slightly, started to appreciate the gravity of the misunderstanding. He glanced at the director with a mix of relief and embarrassment. His body language suggested he was grappling with emotions, relief that no one had been hurt, shame over the unnecessary escalation, and curiosity about the man standing before him. The director, perceiving this, offered a reassuring smile, a simple gesture that helped to humanize the interaction. The director then took the opportunity to gently instruct all present on the importance of verification and clear communication. He emphasized that even experienced officers could misinterpret situations and that maintaining composure was crucial. His words were direct but not accusatory, framed as guidance rather than criticism. It was a masterclass in leadership under pressure, observed not only by the officers but also by the growing number of onlookers. During this time, dispatch continued to monitor the situation, providing updates and confirming details. The director kept his focus on the people around him, recognizing that the real danger in such scenarios often came from panic and miscommunication. He observed subtle cues, the tightening of shoulders, the quick glances, the slight tremors that indicated stress levels. His ability to read these signals allowed him to adapt his approach, offering words of reassurance or pausing to let the officers process their thoughts. A reporter who had arrived on the scene began asking questions from a distance, trying to understand what had happened. The director refrained from making detailed public statements in the middle of the incident, understanding that premature commentary could complicate matters. Instead, he maintained a calm presence, demonstrating through action what professionalism and patience looked like. As the night deepened, the director and the officer slowly transitioned from tension to controlled dialogue. The initial officer, now visibly more composed, admitted that he had allowed his anxiety to influence his judgment. The director acknowledged the confession, validating the difficulty of the situation without fostering shame. It was a subtle, human-centric way of ensuring that learning and accountability could coexist with dignity. By this point, the presence of the crowd had decreased, but some neighbors remained, quietly observing the resolution. The director remained aware of their eyes on him, understanding that public perception mattered. He continued to display calm authority, never losing sight of the fact that human emotions, fear, curiosity, and anxiety, were central to every action taking place. Finally, the scene began to wind down. The officers had verified all details, confirmed that the situation was safe, and debriefed with each other about the incident. The director, while relieved, reflected on how quickly a routine moment could turn dangerous. He appreciated the complexity of human reactions and the importance of training that goes beyond technical skills to include emotional intelligence and judgment under pressure. As he prepared to leave, he addressed the initial officer directly, speaking with a measured tone. "Today could have gone very differently," he said. "But we are all human and we all make mistakes. The important thing is that we learn from them and ensure that safety comes first." The officer nodded, absorbing the words and the weight behind them. The director finally returned to his vehicle, his calm demeanor intact despite the adrenaline that had surged moments before. As he drove away, he glanced at the street behind him, reflecting on the unusual encounter. The city lights blurred in his rearview mirror, and he allowed himself a quiet sigh of relief. The incident was a stark reminder that even in positions of power, one was never immune to human error, and that maintaining composure and empathy was as vital as any badge or title. For the officers who remained, the night would be remembered as a lesson in judgment, communication, and restraint. For the bystanders, it was an extraordinary glimpse into the reality of law enforcement and the human stories behind uniforms and authority. And for the director, it was another chapter in a long career filled with complex decisions, unexpected challenges, and the ongoing necessity of patience, understanding, and leadership under pressure. By the time the backup officers had fully verified the director's identity, a sense of disbelief and relief spread through the group. The initial officer who had triggered the intense stop lowered his weapon completely, his hands shaking slightly as the weight of the mistake settled in. He had acted out of duty, but now he faced the reality of how quickly fear and misjudgment could escalate into a dangerous moment. The director remained calm, his demeanor steady, understanding that the officer was experiencing a whirlwind of emotions. Fear, embarrassment, and guilt. Rather than expressing anger, he focused on guiding the situation toward resolution. His calm approach had a ripple effect, allowing other officers to regain composure and begin to debrief the initial encounter professionally. The backup officers took control of the vehicle check and ensured that all information was properly documented. They were careful, methodical, and precise, knowing that this incident was extraordinary. While they moved efficiently, their body language showed they were aware of the unusual circumstances. A top federal official had been mistakenly stopped and held at gunpoint. It was a situation that few law enforcement officers would ever imagine experiencing. As the scene settled, the director took a moment to speak to the officers collectively. "I know this was tense," he began, his tone calm but authoritative. "But we need to remember that every interaction carries risk. Today we managed to avoid a tragedy because of patience and careful communication. There are lessons here for all of us." His words were deliberate, a mix of acknowledgement, education, and reflection. The first officer, still visibly shaken, looked at him and nodded, the shame and relief battling for dominance in his expression. The director recognized the complexity of human behavior under pressure and allowed the officer to maintain dignity while facing accountability. It was a delicate balance, one that only experience could guide effectively. Neighbors who had observed the incident from a distance slowly began to retreat to their homes. They whispered among themselves, some still recording, some discussing the incredible scene they had witnessed. The director noticed the subtle reactions of the crowd, understanding that the public was watching not just for drama, but for a lesson in how law enforcement interacts with citizens and even with each other. His behavior set a standard in real time, showing that professionalism and calmness could prevail in high-stress scenarios. Dispatch officers continued to relay updates, and the director maintained his focus on the human elements. He noted the way the initial officer shifted his weight, the slight tremors in his hands, and the tension in his shoulders. These were signs of stress, fatigue, and the lingering effects of adrenaline. The director knew that addressing these human factors was just as important as verifying credentials or enforcing protocol. The first officer, once the initial shock had worn off, began explaining his perspective more thoroughly. He shared how he had perceived the vehicle as suspicious, how his training had prompted caution, and how the unfolding scenario had triggered fear. His voice was quieter now, tinged with regret but also honesty. He had acted within the scope of his understanding, yet he acknowledged that fear had clouded judgment. The director listened carefully, nodding occasionally to encourage openness. He understood that mistakes were human, and that learning from them required honest reflection. "We all have moments where fear can influence our decisions," he said gently. "The key is recognizing it, learning from it, and making sure safety is always the priority." His words were not reprimands but guidance, demonstrating a leadership style that emphasized growth and understanding rather than punishment alone. Meanwhile, backup officers continued their procedural checks. They reviewed the car, the documents, and the officer's actions to ensure that nothing had been overlooked. The director remained engaged, observing and occasionally offering insights that were measured and practical. He demonstrated that even in authority, one could maintain humility while reinforcing the importance of diligence. The initial officer took a step back, visibly breathing more steadily. The realization of how easily situations could escalate left him quiet, reflective, and perhaps a little shaken. The director recognized that this moment would stay with him, shaping future decisions and interactions. Rather than adding to the officer's stress, the director offered calm reinforcement, emphasizing lessons rather than judgment. The bystanders who had been quietly watching now began to discuss the event among themselves. Some shared their astonishment at the idea that a top federal official could be involved in such a stop. Others expressed concern for both the officer and the director. The director, aware of the optics, maintained a composed presence, ensuring that the human aspect of the interaction, calm, communication, and understanding, was clearly visible to everyone. After several minutes, the situation began to de-escalate further. The officers began to gather their notes, and the initial officer, though still quiet, started to regain confidence. The director observed closely, aware that moments like these could either empower or demoralize those involved. He chose to speak again, offering a reflection that combined accountability with encouragement. "Today could have gone differently," he said, his tone measured, "but the fact that it didn't shows the value of patience and communication. Mistakes happen. What matters is how we respond and what we learn from them." His words resonated not only with the officer, but also with the other backup officers, emphasizing the human-centered approach to law enforcement. Acknowledge errors, understand the human condition, and improve systems for the future. The initial officer finally spoke, his voice steadier now. "I understand. I was just following what I thought was necessary, but I see now how it escalated. I will learn from this." The director nodded, acknowledging the honesty and the willingness to grow. It was a moment of human connection, bridging authority and humility, stress and calmness. Throughout the scene, the director maintained awareness of the subtle human dynamics at play. He noticed how the backup officers were communicating quietly, checking with each other and making sure that the situation remained safe. He also noted the residual tension in the first officer, understanding that even though immediate danger had passed, the emotional impact would linger. It was a reminder that human reactions were as crucial to manage as the physical and procedural elements of law enforcement. Eventually, the decision was made to allow the director to continue his journey. Officers provided a respectful escort, ensuring a safe path through the streets while also preserving the dignity of everyone involved. The initial officer, though still processing the experience, felt a mix of relief and humility. He had faced one of the most unusual moments of his career, and had survived it without harm. guided in part by the director's calm and measured presence. As the director drove away, he reflected quietly on the encounter. It was a vivid reminder that even experienced officers and high-ranking officials could find themselves in unexpected and dangerous situations. The lessons were clear. Maintain composure, communicate with clarity, respect human emotions, and ensure safety above all else. These were the principles that guided him throughout his career and had once again proven their value. The night settled around the city streets, but the echoes of the incident lingered. For the initial officer, it was a humbling lesson in judgment, fear, and responsibility. For the director, it was a confirmation of the importance of patience, empathy, and leadership. And for the observers, it was an unforgettable display of the human side of law enforcement, showing that behind every uniform and badge was a person capable of fear, courage, and growth. By the time the director reached a quieter street near his home, the city had returned to its usual rhythm. The adrenaline of the encounter slowly faded, replaced by reflection and the understanding that such moments, though rare, carried profound significance. The experience would remain with him, not just as an event to recount, but as a reinforcement of the delicate balance between authority and humanity, vigilance and understanding, fear and calm. In the hours that followed, discussions about the incident began to circulate quietly among law enforcement circles. Officers shared accounts, debriefed with supervisors, and reflected on the unusual dynamics of the stop. The director, while maintaining discretion, understood the ripple effect of the encounter. It was not only a story about mistaken identity, but also a lesson in human behavior, communication, and the critical importance of measured response in moments of high tension. The morning after the incident, the city seemed ordinary again, but the weight of the previous night lingered among those involved. Inside the local precinct, officers gathered to discuss the events. The initial officer sat quietly, reviewing the situation in his mind. The realization of what had happened, that he had held the FBI director at gunpoint, was difficult to process. He had acted out of caution, following the protocols he had been taught, but the consequences of his decisions were now clear. The precinct captain called a meeting to go over the incident in detail. Officers presented their accounts, discussing the sequence of events, decisions made, and communication breakdowns. The atmosphere was serious, respectful, and somber. Everyone understood the gravity of the situation. Mistakes had been made, but the focus now was on accountability, learning, and preventing future occurrences. The FBI director, meanwhile, returned to his routine, but the experience weighed heavily on his mind. He reflected on how quickly routine actions could spiral into life-threatening moments. He thought about the human aspects of law enforcement: fear, instinct, and the split-second decisions officers make under pressure. He also considered the broader implications of the incident for both local and federal law enforcement. Word of the encounter began to spread through local news and social media. Videos filmed by bystanders circulated online, sparking discussions about law enforcement practices, training, and accountability. The public was fascinated, some expressing outrage at the officers' actions while others tried to understand the human factors that led to such a tense moment. The director remained measured in his response, understanding the need for calm, responsible communication to avoid escalating public concern. The initial officer, now facing scrutiny and internal review, was placed on administrative leave while the investigation proceeded. The process was thorough and deliberate. Investigators reviewed every piece of evidence, including body cam footage, witness accounts, and communication logs. The goal was not just to assign blame, but to understand how such a situation could occur and how future training could prevent it. During the review, the officer was interviewed multiple times. He expressed deep regret and a commitment to learn from the incident. His honesty and cooperation were noted, but the seriousness of the error could not be ignored. The FBI director's presence loomed over the discussion, not as a figure of intimidation, but as a reminder of the stakes involved when fear and protocol collide. Experts in law enforcement training were consulted. They analyzed the officer's actions and responses, considering psychological and procedural factors. Their insights emphasized that while training is essential, human emotions often override protocols in high-pressure situations. This perspective became central to understanding the incident, highlighting the need for improved guidance on decision-making under stress. The director took the opportunity to speak publicly about the incident, emphasizing the human side of law enforcement. He praised the officer's commitment to duty, while also acknowledging the risks of misjudgment. His statements were carefully crafted to promote learning, accountability, and reflection rather than criticism or sensationalism. He encouraged law enforcement agencies to focus on communication, patience, and empathy as critical components of training. Community leaders and residents who had witnessed the incident reached out to the director and the local police department. They expressed concern for safety and accountability, wanting assurances that similar mistakes would not happen in the future. The director responded with openness and a commitment to constructive dialogue, reinforcing the importance of transparency and trust between law enforcement and the community. Within the precinct, the atmosphere was one of careful reflection. Officers discussed the emotional toll of the incident, acknowledging the stress and fear that had influenced decisions. They shared strategies for staying calm under pressure and highlighted the importance of mentorship, experience, and supervision in developing sound judgment. The incident became a case study in the human aspects of policing, a story that underscored the need for continuous learning and improvement. As days passed, the officer continued to process the events. He met with supervisors, trainers, and counselors to understand the impact of fear and instinct on his behavior. He committed to additional training focused on decision-making under pressure, de-escalation techniques, and clear communication. The process was rigorous but necessary, reinforcing the principle that accountability includes both correction and education. Meanwhile, the director continued to advocate for improved training and communication across law enforcement. He spoke at meetings, conferences, and community events, sharing his experience not to criticize but to educate. He emphasized that mistakes could occur even among the most trained and disciplined officers, and that empathy, patience, and clear communication were vital tools in preventing escalation. The media coverage, while initially sensational, began to shift toward understanding the human story. Articles and segments highlighted the challenges officers face, the pressures of split-second decision-making, and the lessons learned from the incident. The public gained insight into the complexities of law enforcement, seeing that mistakes are often rooted in human instinct rather than malice. The first officer, through the process of investigation and reflection, began to regain a sense of purpose. He understood the severity of his actions, but also recognized the opportunity to grow and improve. Mentorship from senior officers, guidance from trainers, and conversations with the director helped him rebuild confidence. The experience became a turning point in his career, shaping his approach to policing and his awareness of the human dimensions of the job. The director, reflecting on the aftermath, recognized the fragile balance between authority, human judgment, and safety. He appreciated the need for systemic improvements in training, communication, and community engagement. The incident reinforced his belief that law enforcement success depends not only on skill and knowledge, but also on understanding, patience, and the ability to manage fear in oneself and others. Over time, the precinct implemented changes inspired by the incident. Training programs were revised to include more focus on decision-making under stress, identification verification, and human psychology. Officers participated in simulations designed to help them recognize and manage fear, instinctive reactions, and communication breakdowns. The director supported these initiatives, offering guidance and insight drawn from his own experience. Community relations also improved as a result of the incident. Meetings between law enforcement and residents provided opportunities for dialogue, trust building, and education. The director emphasized that transparency and accountability are essential for maintaining public confidence. The story became a lesson in how challenges can lead to growth, both for individuals and institutions. In the weeks that followed, the initial officer reflected deeply on the incident. He understood that mistakes, while regrettable, could become powerful catalysts for personal and professional development. The director's calm, human-centered approach had left a lasting impression, demonstrating that leadership is as much about empathy and guidance as it is about authority. The story of that night, once a tense confrontation on a city street, evolved into a broader narrative about human behavior, accountability, and the importance of learning from mistakes. The director's role, while central, highlighted the significance of patience, communication, and leadership in navigating difficult situations. For everyone involved, the officers, the community, and the director himself, the incident became a reminder that human understanding is the most critical tool in any high-stakes environment. The investigation into the incident concluded after several weeks, bringing clarity and consequences. The initial officer, whose actions had sparked the tense encounter, was found to have violated protocol and acted recklessly under pressure. The administrative review determined that accountability was necessary, not just for fairness, but to ensure that future officers understood the importance of restraint and judgment. The officer was suspended and eventually faced legal consequences, including a period of jail time. The decision was difficult for the law enforcement community to accept fully, as many understood the human factors at play. However, it reinforced the principle that authority comes with responsibility, and mistakes, particularly those that endanger lives, cannot be ignored. The FBI director, while relieved that the situation was resolved, reflected on the incident with a mixture of concern and gratitude. He was grateful for his safety and for the lessons learned, but he remained deeply aware of how fragile control can be in high-stakes encounters. He considered the incident a case study in human behavior, judgment, and the importance of leadership that emphasizes calm, clarity, and empathy. He met with the first officer before the legal proceedings began, offering a private conversation focused on reflection and growth. "You made a serious mistake," he said calmly, "but it doesn't define you. What defines you is what you do next, how you learn, how you grow, and how you ensure it doesn't happen again." The officer listened intently, absorbing the guidance and feeling both remorse and motivation to improve. It was a human moment of accountability and compassion, demonstrating leadership beyond formal authority. Meanwhile, the local police department began implementing new protocols and training inspired by the incident. Officers were trained in decision-making under pressure, de-escalation techniques, and human-centered approaches to law enforcement. Simulations were introduced to teach how fear and instinct can influence judgment, and officers practiced methods to remain calm, verify identities, and communicate clearly even in high-stress situations. Community leaders continued to engage with the police department, emphasizing transparency and collaboration. The incident, while alarming, became an opportunity to improve trust and understanding between law enforcement and residents. Public meetings were held, and the director participated remotely in some sessions, sharing insights without revealing sensitive details. His emphasis was always on safety, learning, and empathy. The first officer, during this time, undertook additional training and counseling. He worked with mentors to develop strategies for managing fear, stress, and rapid decision-making. Every session reinforced the lessons learned from the incident, highlighting the need for awareness, patience, and communication. Though the process was challenging, it offered him a path toward redemption and professional growth. The media coverage shifted focus from sensationalism to education. Stories emphasized the human dimensions of law enforcement, showing that even experienced officers can make mistakes under pressure. Experts analyzed the incident, highlighting lessons in psychology, communication, and leadership. The public discussion moved toward understanding, accountability, and the importance of systems that support officers in making safe decisions. The director continued his work, mindful of the experience and the lessons it carried. He incorporated discussions of human behavior, risk, and communication into briefings and training sessions, ensuring that his own team and others in law enforcement understood the broader implications of what had occurred. He spoke about the need to balance vigilance with patience, authority with empathy, and rules with awareness of human emotions. Over time, the precinct noticed changes in behavior and culture. Officers became more deliberate in their interactions, more focused on communication, and more attentive to human cues during stops and investigations. The incident, while initially tense and alarming, had sparked a transformation in training and approach. It was a reminder that mistakes, when addressed thoughtfully, can lead to meaningful growth. The first officer, despite the personal and professional consequences, emerged with a renewed sense of purpose. The experience had humbled him, taught him the limits of instinct and reinforced the importance of calm, careful judgment. His reflections on the incident were shared with colleagues as part of mentoring and training programs, further spreading the lessons learned. The director, reflecting privately, recognized that the incident would remain a defining moment in his career, not for the danger he faced, but for the insights it provided into human behavior, leadership, and accountability. He understood that authority alone could not prevent mistakes, and that empathy, communication, and patience were essential tools in maintaining safety and trust. Community members, having observed the incident unfold and following the developments, gained a deeper appreciation for the complexities of law enforcement. They saw officers as humans capable of fear, error, and growth, and they witnessed the importance of transparency and accountability. The incident became a story of caution, learning, and the human side of policing. Months later, the precinct continued to benefit from the lessons of that night. Training programs were more comprehensive, mentoring systems were strengthened, and officers were better prepared for high-pressure encounters. The director's role, though primarily in reflection and guidance, underscored the importance of leadership that prioritizes understanding and human-centered approaches. In the end, the story of the FBI director being stopped and held at gunpoint became more than a sensational headline. It became a narrative of accountability, learning, and the power of calm leadership. It showed that even those in positions of great authority are vulnerable to human error, and that the key to preventing tragedy lies in patience, empathy, and thoughtful communication. For the first officer, the experience reshaped his career and approach to law enforcement. For the director, it reinforced the principles that had guided him for decades, and for the community, it offered a glimpse into the humanity behind uniforms, badges, and authority, reminding everyone that at the heart of every decision is a human being capable of fear, courage, and growth.